Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Dr. Larry Heller, Brad Kammer, and Stephanie Klein. Thanks for joining us. FAN celebrates its 40th anniversary this year, and we're honored to have the robust support of dozens of schools, nonprofits, corporations, and families and individuals from across the country. We are committed to our vision of an informed and compassionate community, and will achieve that vision by presenting fresh ideas that elevate minds, expand hearts, and make the world a better place. We have hundreds of videos of past events archived on our YouTube channel, so be sure to explore and subscribe to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for a few short introductions. Dr. Larry Heller is the creator of the NeuroAffective Relational Model, known as NARM, a specialized psychobiological approach to working with developmental trauma. He holds a Ph.D. in psychology and was in private practice for over 30 years. He is currently a senior faculty member with the NARM Training Institute, and for the past 30 years, he has been conducting seminars in the NARM approach throughout the US and Europe. Brad Kammer is a NARM master therapist, consultant, and faculty trainer, teaching NARM and working with complex trauma internationally. He is also a somatic experiencing practitioner, consultant, and faculty trainer. He began his career as a humanitarian aid worker in Asia, and he became passionate about supporting individuals and communities in the transformation of trauma. His work focuses on the integration of mind-body psychology, interpersonal neurobiology, and wisdom from spiritual traditions and traditional cultures. Stephanie Klein is a licensed clinical social worker, somatic experiencing practitioner, and NARM master therapist, consultant, and faculty member. She has spent 22 years in her private practice specializing in treating adults with trauma and anxiety disorders. She has provided consultation and mentoring to therapists and helping professionals around the world. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Larry Heller, Brad Kammer, and Stephanie Klein.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Lonnie and Anne Marie. Thank you for those lovely introductions, and thank you for inviting us to be part of this fan event. It's wonderful to be able to connect to the fan community. And I want to thank everybody who's here, that's here because they want to learn about the NeuroAffective Relational Model, NARM for short, and the new book, The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. And whether you're here for your own interest in your own personal learning, growth, transformation, and healing, or whether you're here as a helping professional who's interested in how you might be able to use NARM to help your clients, I think we can all agree that the world can be a pretty traumatic place. And anytime we can come together as a community to learn about how to heal that, or like Lonnie said about FAN, how to make the world a better place, it's a good day. So thank you all for being here. I get the pleasure of sort of facilitating this conversation, and it isn't very often that Brad and Larry and I get to be in the same room together anymore and have a conversation, because we're all usually out teaching different classes and doing different things to bring NARM more into the world. So this is kind of a treat. Brad, Larry, I thought maybe you just want to say hello.
Yeah, just hi, everyone. And again, thank you for being here, and thanks to FAN for having us. And it is nice for the three of us to be together in a room like, as you say, it doesn't happen so often.
Yeah, we wish we could be in Chicago with all of you, but this is the second best. And just thanks again to everyone for being here with us. And we're excited to share with you about NARM, and hopefully you'll be able to take something away that will be supportive for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it might be helpful to just start out with giving people a sense of what NARM is. And, because I know what NARM is, I know that that's not a simple question, but I was wondering if I could pitch this to you, Larry. If you could just do a little kind of NARM in a nutshell, or a bit of an overview of what NARM is.
Well, obviously, it's a model of psychotherapy. It's a somatically based psychotherapy. There are some really key differences between the way NARM approaches trauma, and of course, C-PTSD and developmental trauma are the focus of the work that we do and the work that we teach. And just maybe a couple of points that the audience will find interesting is that one of the key elements in NARM is that it isn't so much the trauma that a person experienced or the ongoing trauma as in the case of developmental trauma, but the adaptations to trauma that we've all made and how we carry those adaptations forward into the present moment. So there's less of an orientation of going on an archaeological expedition into the past. What we find, excuse me, what we find is that when we're working effectively in the present moment with the client, with whatever elements that they're wanting to deal with, that whatever is unresolved from the past tends to emerge organically. So that's a really important distinction. And you know, I'll pass it over to Brad, and I'm sure you've got some things that you want to add there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Larry, for creating this beautiful model. And I know, Larry, you've been in this field for a long, long time, probably longer than Fan's been around, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's true.
And we really appreciate it. And I think the first place to start is just to define that it's the NeuroAffective Relational Model. And Larry, you can, of course, add on to this, but you know, the neuroaffective has to do with the nervous system, with the body, with the physiology, and how trauma impacts our brain and our nervous system. And then the affective has to do with the emotional. NARM is a model that focuses very much on emotions and how emotions get disrupted in early trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments, because it's one of the key factors of complex PTSD. And the relational piece is very critical. You know, many ways of working are with, you know, helping professionals and clients or in group settings, but we really bring a certain kind of understanding of the relationship that is part of the healing process of NARM. So there's a lot of elements that we integrate. And the last piece I'd like to say that really has impacted me so much from NARM is over the last 20, 30 years, you know, there's been a lot of focus on mindfulness, which has been great in psychology and just in the general public. And one of the things we've been focusing on in NARM is really taking mindfulness and bringing it deeper into the body. And we have a term that we talk about, which is heartfulness, and that the heart really makes us human. And Larry will talk a little bit more about the first book he wrote, about how much of this model is really based on connection to self and others. And so we're really trying to bring kind of a greater sense of humanity back into psychology and hopefully, you know, back into our world.
Mm-hmm. And we hope too, just to add on to what Brad was saying, to give you maybe a slightly different perspective on working with emotions, because it's not NARM is not regressive or cathartic. It's more a model about containing, learning to be present to, and then be able to embody emotions. And we talk about we have the emotional completion model, which has to do with listening to the emotions, containing them, and really working with what it is that they're trying to communicate. And we do that in service of shifting old ideas about ourselves, particularly the painful identifications that we carry, the shame-based identifications, the self-judgment, the self-criticism, the self-hatred even. So there's a lot of focus on how, you know, and we'll be presenting some of that today in terms of how you actually address these dynamics and how to work with them.
Just want to add, Stephanie, before I give it back to you, that's chapter 7 in the book. You know, the book is written, we'll talk more about the book, but to really make it accessible, not just for people in the mental health profession, but for anyone that just wants to learn more or even apply some of this for themselves. And so Larry presented the NARM emotional completion model, and that's chapter 7 of the book. And there's a whole bunch of exercises that you can practice yourself or with a partner.
So Brad, while you're talking, you know, Larry created this model. We both learned from Larry. He's been a mentor to both of us. What drew you to this work? You know, as Lonnie introduced you, you have a deep background in a lot of different somatic models. What really drew you and attracted you to NARM?
Yeah. Well, you know, I was trained originally to work with PTSD, shock trauma, as we call it often in NARM. And I found that most of my clients that were coming in to see me weren't really coming in for shock trauma. Occasionally that was true, but a lot of times they were coming because they just had everyday issues, relational challenges, anxiety, depression, substance abuse disorders, or other addictive disorders. And I was realizing that the skills that I had gotten trained in sometimes wasn't going far enough or deep enough. And luckily in my somatic training, when I was still in graduate school, I had a brilliant teacher, Dr. Laurence Heller, who, at that point, Larry was teaching really a model for working with shock trauma, but on the side, he had already been teaching for working with relationships and with developmental trauma, complex trauma. So I started to study with Larry, and I was very deeply moved by the relational pieces. And like I mentioned before, bringing kind of this understanding of humanity back into psychology and working with trauma. So I mentioned this yesterday. Larry and I were teaching yesterday, but I mentioned I was still in graduate school when I first was in his class, one of his classes. And he mentioned something, I'm sure I'm getting this wrong in the quote, but something about how the most important thing to be a really effective therapist is to be curious. Mm-hmm. And it really hit me hard because as a child growing up, I was super curious, like really, really curious, but it wasn't looked at as a strength. It was actually kind of attacked often. And I felt a lot of shame about it. I felt like I should know things. And when I got to graduate school to become a therapist, I was like learning everything and trying to like learn these models. And then I would sit with another human being and I was losing my curiosity. And so when Larry introduced that, it really brought me back to a place that I wanted to be. And so I think that was another piece that drew me in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You've both talked about humanity and humanness and heartfulness, and just makes me think about some of the things that I know that inspired you while you were creating your approach that became NARM. Larry, I know a lot of your inspiration had to do with wanting to really humanize and depathologize childhood trauma. So I just thought maybe this would be a good time to share a little bit about what inspired you around this model, to create this model.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Stephanie. Well, as with everyone, I of course was exposed to many different models in my earlier training, and then, after graduate school, exploring different ways of working with people. It was before there was even much talk about shock trauma or developmental trauma. We had a whole different language in the earlier days when I started. And I learned a lot of things, of course, and then I also saw many elements in these different models that I felt were reductionistic. They reduced people to either to nervous systems or to brain parts or to neurochemicals or to their personal history. And all of those elements were involved. I have no argument with that, but it reduces human beings to more like a product of conditioning rather than what we hold in NARM, which is, and we'll talk more about, which is this theme of agency. And when I mentioned earlier about how we make these adaptations as a child that save our life, and then we continue with those adaptations, using them in our lives, and the same adaptations that once saved our lives are in our adult lives, the very elements that create the symptoms that we have. And I saw that wasn't being addressed in a way that I thought was most useful. There was a lot of focus on the past, and I did numerous kinds of regressive therapies. Again, there were some interesting things that I learned, but there was a lot that I took out of there that I thought, in terms of like a negative example, I knew that I didn't want to do regressive work. I didn't want to have people, doing deep breathing and pounding pillows. That didn't seem to be helpful to me or to the people that I knew. And so really the whole journey began in terms of refining what I had been learning, and then along the way coming up with some not just reactions to some of what I felt was missing, but really just starting to understand some different ways of looking at things that hadn't been out there as far as I was aware of, at least, and continued over many years to build that into a model that later became, or in the last maybe 15 years, has become is now called NARM, but I was working on this model for 30, 40 years, really. And both adding to it from things I learned and then learning things that I didn't want to do. So that was kind of the short story of the process.
Mm-hmm. How NARM came to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Steph,
yeah.
Steph, how about you? You want to tell us about what drew you to NARM?
Oh, wait, I'm the one asking the questions. Yeah, I also came out of a shock trauma model, and I started getting some consultation with Larry, and there was just this way that he languaged things and this way that he conceptualized things that was just so compelling to me and just spoke to me, after years and years and years in the field. And I just found that as I started to apply his approach, that was, again, in the process of becoming a book and being called NARM, my clients started to move forward in ways that I was stuck with a lot of people in terms of long-term work, where I felt like we had done a lot of good work, but there was more, and there was something I couldn't get to. So the two things I always talk about was that not only did this approach touch me and really speak to me, but it made me a better therapist. And that this was a big one for me. I experienced so much more ease in my work. It really changed my relationship to the role. This goes back to the relational model and sort of how we include ourselves as human beings in the relational work of healing relational trauma. And the combination of those two things, the effectiveness and the greater ease that I felt inside of myself, it was just like, I'm done. This is my career now. So,
and we're glad to have you.
Thanks for asking me. We talked a little bit about, we've all mentioned shock trauma and complex trauma. And, the word trauma for decades and decades was really primarily associated with the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from shock trauma and event trauma. And NARM was uniquely designed to treat the long-term impacts of developmental and complex trauma. So I thought it would be helpful for the audience for you to differentiate a little bit between those two types of trauma. Mm-hmm. So I'll just toss that to either, both, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, I'll start and then I'll pass the baton on to you, Brad. But I think one of the most important distinctions for us to make is that generally, not always, but generally, what we call shock trauma, what traditionally is called PTSD, is more of a single incident kind of trauma, and overwhelming and devastating kinds of things that happen to people. Whereas developmental trauma, there's a couple of important elements that make a distinction. One is that there's a chronicity, or a chronic quality. In other words, it's not usually just a single event, although there might be some important single events that we need to address, but it's the day-to-day kinds of dynamics in, very dysfunctional families where there's a lot of shaming and blaming and physical abuse and emotional abuse, sometimes sexual abuse. So all of these different kinds of dynamics that don't just happen in a single moment, but are part of a whole arc of a person's life. And the other piece in that is the relational trauma. It's that it's very different. As terrible as shock trauma is at the hands of a stranger, like being assaulted or whatever, that, but to have the people that you depend on 100% for safety and love to be the actual perpetrators of abuse in a variety of different ways that happens, requires a different model. And that's what I was hoping to, or trying to address as I was developing NARM. So
Brad, you want to add anything to that?
Yes. So right around the time FAN started, 1980 was when PTSD was officially recognized. It was the DSM-3, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health. And like Stephanie said, that's been just what people think of with trauma. And for many, many years, there's been a movement. We call it the trauma-informed movement. It's a very large movement of a lot of different people, not just in mental health. And in 1992, there was a famous book that came out, Dr. Judith Herman's book called Trauma and Recovery. And she basically said what Larry just said, that PTSD doesn't go far enough, particularly when there's been relational trauma. And she suggested we use a new diagnosis to differentiate it from PTSD. And she called it C-PTSD, complex PTSD. And here we are 30 years later, and we do not have a C-PTSD diagnosis in the United States. It has been approved worldwide, but because the United States uses a different system, it has not yet been approved here. So in some ways, people that are working in the field of complex trauma are pretty ahead of the game. And we like to think that in a couple of years, there's going to be a lot of need for people that can work with complex trauma, which is one of the things that Larry, Steph, and I are very focused on, is training practitioners. So I'm going to do this really briefly, but basically with PTSD, there's kind of three main categories. So this is when there's a shock trauma, like Larry talked about. It could be anything. It could be a fall off a ladder. It could be a car accident. Generally, you see what we call hypervigilance, which people are, when's the next shoe going to drop? They come into situations with a lot of startle, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. The second one is they often have some kind of intrusive images, or what they call re-experiencing. So whether it's nightmares or flashbacks or intrusive images. And then the third piece is what they talk about with avoidance, that then we spend a lot of energy trying to avoid different triggers. So if you got in a car accident at a certain intersection, people will spend 10 years driving around Chicago or Northern California and not going through that intersection. So, but what we started to see when we work with more relational and developmental trauma is that they've added three new categories on top of those original three categories for PTSD. And the three have to do with, one is what they call negative self-concept. I'm sure most of us can relate to this on some level, where it's self-esteem issues, self-worth issues, feeling in some way that, we don't deserve to be loved, or it's hard for us to feel confident in ourselves. And that gets very much disrupted by early or complex trauma. The second category is what they refer to as affect regulation, or actually affect dysregulation, which means that we stop being able to feel in control of our emotional and somatic, our physical responses. And that leads people to feel really scared when they feel out of control. They can't regulate themselves, trouble sleeping, all sorts of things that can happen with that. And then the third category, which is probably the most pronounced, is it ruptures our capacity to have healthy relationships. And so no wonder why relationships are fraught with so much stress and conflict, because we have learned early in our life that relationships are often full of fear, betrayal, shame, and it's difficult to trust in relationships and feel like we can have intimate relationships and be authentic in ourselves and be open for intimacy. So these three new categories are so much of what we work with as psychologists, as mental health professionals, but it's also so much of what we're struggling with in so many ways in our life. So it, not that we really care that much about diagnoses, but at least the three of us, but so many of the things that people are struggling with, whether it's depression, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, what if underneath all of those symptoms is really these unresolved patterns that Larry was referring to before, these adaptive survival patterns that just need some support for resolution. And we find a lot of hope in working beneath the symptoms, beneath the behaviors that are creating distress for people, and helping them really learn how to heal these different categories for themselves.
Yeah, we're always asking the question, instead of being primarily symptom focused, like many therapies are, we're always asking the question, what is it that's driving these symptoms? And so we're not just looking to extinguish symptoms, we actually use symptoms to give us a clue as to what the underlying dynamics are. And as we address those underlying dynamics in NARM, and hopefully and often, the resolution comes for the individual, that then the symptoms just tend to fall away. And it's really more of a depth orientation than some models, I would say, and that's been our focus, and that's what we also try to teach in the NARM model.
So while we're on the topic of these deep underlying patterns, I want to ask a little bit about toxic shame, and how adverse childhood experiences, how early trauma leads to toxic shame, and which then leads to all of these symptoms that are so, and maladaptive behaviors that are so distressing and create so much suffering for people.
Mm-hmm. You want to take it, Brad, or I'm happy to take it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Larry.
okay. Well, this is actually a theme that, I've spent a lot of time with. There's another book that's only out in German so far that's just about freeing oneself from shame, but to kind of dive deeper into this theme of shame, it's important to understand that the shame dynamic is part of one of the adaptive mechanisms that we as human beings, and that children in particular, have used to try and make sense of the broad categories environmental failure that they're experiencing, whether that's on the hands of the parents or community-wise or whatever. But the way that a child tries to make sense of this environmental failure is ultimately to blame themselves. And there are reasons for that, and I'll touch into them, but that's the beginning of shame. It's like, so for example, let's just take the broad category of not feeling lovable, which is a theme that many people struggle with. And as those of you who've tried to convince somebody who's being very hard on themselves and are convinced that they're not lovable, you have seen that it doesn't work. People can't be talked into feeling that they're okay, or that they're better than they think that they are, or that they shouldn't feel so ashamed, or whatever the dynamics are. And that's because shame has played in a child's life in particular a protective function. And here's kind of in a nutshell what that is that think about it from a child's perspective. Is it better to be the unlovable child of parents who have the capacity to love, or the lovable child with parents who don't have the capacity to love you? Well, if you think about it from a child's perspective, there's no choice, because if the parents who are, hopefully, ideally, they're the ones who communicate love. If the child believes that the parents don't have the capacity for love, in a child's mind, there's no love left in the universe, and that leaves them alone and empty. And it's also part of the early attachment relationship, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This fear of the loss of the attachment relationship, the fear of the loss of the love relationship. So it's actually a solution for the child to think of themselves as somehow defective or unlovable, or there's many variations on the theme, rather than to believe that it's, let's say, the parents' shortcoming or the parents' lack of capacity. So it's a really important and fundamental aspect of what we teach in NARM, is how to work with these, the shame-based identifications that really all of us as human beings carry around. And when from the adult perspective, when we look at this theme of shame and we're not identified with it and living inside it, we're able to release it in much quicker ways than many people often expect. But understanding and working with shame is fundamental, at least one fundamental element of the NARM work.
Maybe I can add on a couple of things. Thanks, Larry. Two things that have to do with parents and children. The first thing, we always like to say, the three of us, when we teach, that there's a lot of parents that are listening to this, and we just want, everyone to know that we're all doing the best we can, and it's important to practice self-compassion with these things, because, there's never going to be perfect parenting, and that's not what we talk about. But the other piece around this is that in NARM, one of the things I think that is useful within psychology is so much psychology has been traditionally focused on failures that are happening with the attachment figures or the parents or the caregivers. And of course, that is so central to a child's life. But in NARM, Larry introduced this term of environmental failure. And we really broaden this, that there's different levels of failure that happen for a child or for a family system that then can impact and create developmental or complex trauma. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs study. I saw that Nadine Burke-Harris, I think, has presented at FAN before. She has written a book and did a famous TED Talk on the ACEs study. So ACEs study is about adverse childhood experiences, and there's 3 levels of adverse childhood experiences. The first is the household, things that are happening within the family system. The second is what's happening in the community. And the third is environment, like the natural environment. For example, we have no idea how this pandemic is going to impact the brain development of the children that have been impacted by this over the last 2 or 3 years, not to mention the family systems and all the social structures. So in NARM, we hold complex trauma because one of the pieces of complex trauma is also intergenerational trauma. And so, if our parents failed us in different ways, who are they but children of parents that probably also failed them? And who are those grandparents but children of parents that also, and you can just keep on going back. And there's also cultural trauma that we're all relating to on a day-by-day basis. And we've also come from collective trauma, living in this country, depending on what community or culture you come from. So these are all factors that play into this environmental failure and part of the complex trauma. And that word complex is true because it's really complex. And it goes back to what Larry was saying. If someone comes in with a symptom, that symptom has elements of all of this complexity that we've been talking about. And it takes a certain way of working with it to really help people shift these deep patterns.
I just want to add too, just so that everybody knows, we're all 3 of us are parents, so we know how challenging it can be to be a parent. And NARM is not oriented towards blaming parents. Now, we are helping people to fully deal with whatever unresolved emotions they might have towards their parents, but it's not about blaming the parents. And that's an important distinction that we make. And again, just to add one element to what, the important information that Brad was just sharing is that when we talk about environmental failure, one of the dynamics that is universal in children is that we internalize the environmental failure that we experience, and that of course changes us, and we adapt to that, and then we carry that internalized trauma forward. And NARM is a model that really helps us to address and ultimately release some of what we've been carrying forward. And as Brad rightly mentioned, this is often the result of generation after generation of of trauma of different kinds that all of our ancestors have experienced. Because after all, the earth, there's a lot of trauma to go around on this planet.
Larry said before that we, in NARM, we don't blame or shame parents. My joke that came to my mind is, we don't need that. We don't need that help. We're already doing it to ourselves.
Exactly.
We don't need anyone else to help us do that. Anyone that's a parent probably has had moments or many moments of doing that to themselves. And what we're actually trying to help parents do is to humanize their own self as a parent and their child. And I'm sure all 3 of us could talk a lot about how this model has helped us in relationship to our kids. And I know, Larry, you're a grandparent now, so
Yeah.
Well, okay, so much. There's so much more I want to ask, and so much more of a conversation I want to have here about this topic of shame. But I want to make sure to ask you to talk a little bit about the book, The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, which came out in July. I'm just going to share with everybody. Came out with July. It's been selling like crazy, doing really well. And the audiobook just came out this month. Yeah. And I want to let everybody know that you both read the book on the audio, which is so special, really, because it's so different to hear the authors read the book. Just want to put that out there. And you got some really great endorsements from Dr. Gabor Mate and from Dr. Lisa Rankin and Dr. Christina Bethel. So I just want to say, hugely excited for you and congratulations.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if you can say a few words about what inspired you to write this book now. There are 2 books now out there on NARM, about 10 to 12 years apart, I think. So what inspired you to write this book right now, and how do you, what kind of impact do you hope this particular book, The Practical Guide, has?
Brad, do you want to?
Sure. Well, I'm not sure I've even told you this story yet, Larry, or not, but I'm going to answer your question. I want to go back just for a moment about the audiobook, because Larry and I were unsure if we were going to do the audiobook. It's a big commitment to go into the studio and do that. And so I was when I went into the studio, I was telling the engineer about that. And like sometime in the middle of the day, I come out to take a break and he has tears running down his face. And he said to me, "I'm so glad that you chose to read this." He's like, "No one else could have delivered this besides the authors." And it was so touching. I mean, here's a guy that just does this every day, not just audiobooks, but also musicians and stuff. And he was listening to the material and touched in that way. So I remember in that moment, maybe I did text you, Larry, but just wow, that was the right thing to do. So anyways, we're getting some really nice feedback, and thank you for those of you that have appreciated that. In terms of, my intention, and, I think probably Larry's and mine are the similar, but I'll share about my intention. It was really to make this work more accessible. One of the things when I started learning psychology, I just felt really frustrated that so much of the psychological literature that is meant to help heal people and heal our world was so dense and complicated and hard to access. And I feel like I'm a pretty smart person, more or less, but I could not make sense of a lot of this stuff. And it really frustrated me. I wanted to feel it. I wanted it to be down to earth. I wanted to really feel it in my own body, my own experience. And the book keeps on falling on me here, but yeah. And so it's been such a big piece of the Institute that, we've created, that the 3 of us are doing all these classes, is to really make this work as accessible as possible. It really is our vision to do our part in contributing to the healing of all the trauma that is out in the world and the ongoing violence and disconnection. And so even if we can just have a little bit of a ripple effect from this book, that will completely feel successful to me.
And just for my part, the first book, which was called Healing Developmental Trauma, there's really presented both the clinical model and the developmental model that is inherent, is part of NARM. But in terms of the space that we had available, there was much more focus on the developmental model. It's hard to say exactly, but maybe 75% was on the developmental piece and 25% was on the how to work with it in the clinical piece. And so when Brad and I were talking about, the whole process, it became clear to us that we really wanted to, to be able to present the clinical model in a more user-friendly way, not just for therapists, but of course, including a lot of therapists, but for anybody who's really interested in understanding the nuts and bolts of personal development, personal growth, and even transformation. And so it came out of wanting to present that piece of it. Now, we specifically called it the practical guide rather than the clinical guide, because we wanted to be clear for everyone that if you're interested in your own growth, that it's accessible. It's not just for clinicians. Now, we've gotten a lot of feedback from clinicians, of course, and that's always welcome, but we're also happy to be able to touch people's lives directly, as Brad was just sharing that, that touching little experience with the sound engineer. And so that was really, part of our common intention in writing this second book here.
Along those lines, there's a lot of exercises in the book. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the exercises and how people can use those, either professionally or personally, or both.
Well, I'll say a couple things, then I'll pass it over to you, because it's something, it's like one of the things that I've always emphasized, and now the three of us and emphasize, and there are other teachers in Europe of NARM as well, is the for therapists is their own work, their work on themselves. That's again part of the R, the relational piece, is that to be able to really be an effective therapist, you've got to know this model from your own personal experience. So whether you're a clinician or a non-clinician, these exercises are designed to help people experience and embody some of the teaching elements that we're trying to get across. And I'm sure, Brad, you'll have things that you want to add to that, but I really wanted to make that point.
Yeah. I think our editor said that we had 37 exercises in the book. I didn't realize we had that many, actually, but yeah, I would just reiterate what Larry said. It was, again, part of the accessibility is about making it come alive and not just talking theory. The theory is important, but we really want to bring it in to have direct experience with it. It's also how we run all of our different events in NARM, our trainings and webinars. We always have some kind of interactive exercises, because it's one thing to know this stuff intellectually. It's another thing to really actually have it live inside of you and change your, the patterns in your life. So that's, again, people can go right over them and they don't have to pause and do the exercises, but they are designed to actually help integrate what we've been talking about in the previous section. So if people want to kind of slow down and do the exercise, it's designed to kind of integrate it. And for people that do work with complex trauma, work with clients or patients or students, some of these exercises can be directly brought into the work you're already doing.
One element I'd like to add about the, kind of drilling down a little deeper on these exercises, many of them are oriented towards what we in NARM talk about as resourcing. So we're in NARM, we don't just focus on everything that's gone wrong. We also put a focus on the strengths and the capacities that people have and that they've developed. So some of the exercises are specifically designed to help resource the client. So, for example, we might talk about, and just invite somebody either personally or with a partner, they can do it either way, to reflect on a time when they experienced themselves as being most connected. And we leave that open. It could be most connected to another person. It could be most connected to nature or to God or the universe, but whatever it was. And then we always invite the person to track, when you do this exercise, to track to pay attention, in other words, or to be mindful of your internal experience, the emotional experience that you have with the exercise, as well as how it affects you on the level of the body. So some of those exercises are designed to evoke that for people, and again help you put you more in touch with positive experiences that you've had and strengths that you've developed over time.
What's really interesting to me about the way we hold these reflective exercises in NARM that are in the book is that we're creating an opportunity for people to connect to themselves by offering these prompts, but we're not actually trying to get them somewhere. I mean, this is a very, very different approach sometimes, even to the idea of resourcing, because the idea is whatever that might come up. I mean, when you invite them to connect to somebody, like a time where they felt deeply connected to something, they might feel sad, or they might get distracted, or they might feel like who knows what's going to come up. And what I really love about NARM is that there isn't really a goal to these exercises. They're truly about inviting curiosity and noticing any aspect of our experience. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
That's a great point, Stephanie. I'm glad you made it.
Yeah, being human. I also wanted to say, Lonnie mentioned at the beginning that there's a grand rounds that Larry and I will be doing tomorrow. And we do have a couple of these exercises. I think maybe 2 or 3 that we'll be doing. They're short, but you'll get a direct experience if you join us tomorrow with that.
So are there any, I don't know, practical tips? Are there any little tidbits that you can offer the audience, things they can use with their clients, things that they can use for themselves that, I don't know, that are NARM inspired in terms of being able to support themselves in healing these early wounds?
I can begin to address that. And then, yeah, I mean, one tip that immediately comes to mind is helping people explore their relationship to anger, to the emotion of anger. And, you know, for some individuals, anger is what we call a default response. You know, they go there very easily, very quickly. And so then we would then have a different question for those individuals. But for many people who are struggling with depression and anxiety and physical symptoms and other kinds of difficulties, they're carrying around so much anger that they have split off, disconnected from, turned against the self, that then end up showing up in a variety of different emotional symptoms, psychological symptoms, sometimes physical symptoms as well. And so it's a very useful kind of element to be mindful of, is like when somebody's chronically anxious, a significant part of the time what we find is that anxiety is actually signaling unresolved anger. And it isn't, again, we're not trying to get people into anger, but to recognize it, to be present to the powerful energies that are present with anger, and to see what it is that the anger is trying to communicate to the environment. That's the emotional completion model. And as that happens, things really tend to transform for people as they integrate anger. So again, for clinicians or for people just doing their own personal work, you know, maybe just be curious about your own relationship to anger. Because for many people who are, you know, struggle with depression or anxiety, if you ask them what's your relationship to anger, usually the answer will be anger. Well, I don't experience much anger. I mean, I get scared or uncomfortable when somebody else gets angry, and of course I get angry at myself. And people say it just like that. Of course I get angry at myself. But you see, they're then telling us what they've learned to do in terms of dealing with this anger that they didn't know how to integrate or manage as you know, as children or as in growing up, and still as adults don't know how to do that. And so that would be one little clinical tip that I would suggest to people. Just again, as an exercise in curiosity and exploration, like just what is your relationship to anger?
Thanks. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
What about you, Brad?
Yeah, I was thinking about chapter 5 is a chapter on the third pillar of NARM. We have 4 pillars in NARM. So the third pillar is agency. And it was by far the hardest chapter to write, and also the one I feel most proud about, because it is one of the distinguishing features of NARM, the way that we hold and talk about agency. It's a term that is kind of confusing in a certain way. The simplest way I can maybe say it is that when you come out of childhood and you've had a lot of unresolved complex trauma, developmental trauma, you don't feel like you're leading your life. You often feel like things are just happening to you. And that sense is not a sense of agency. It's actually quite the opposite. So then there's a lot of shame and blame that gets created because things are happening that you don't feel good about or like. And just like Larry said earlier, you can't just like tell someone to like have compassion for themselves. You can't tell someone to just take agency in their life. That's not how it works. There are deep obstacles in the way of us feeling more confidence and more capacity inside of ourselves. And so the third chapter really, outlines and provides a bunch of exercises and also some language that can help you if you are a helping professional about how to bring some of this language around agency into the work. And many people that come through our trainings say that learning agency from a NARM perspective is a game changer. And that's why I think I felt, a lot of pressure. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to really get that chapter in a way that captured what people are experiencing from learning agency. So I think there's some really good practical tips that can really have direct impact, immediate impact in your life, just even in that chapter.
You may not have noticed, but Brad just used the language of agency in his own process, talking about, he said, I felt a lot of pressure, and then he changed it to the language of agencies. I put a lot of pressure on myself. And and so it was a good, conscious or unconscious. I don't know if you were
Setting
thinking
you
that.
up. Yeah, setting you up.
Well, you did. And it's important to understand that it is looking at agency, but it's not about blame. As a matter of fact, blaming oneself or even blaming others is not about agency. It is about taking ownership and seeing our part in the struggles that we have, the emotional difficulties, the relational difficulties that we have. So I particularly avoided the word responsibility that other models use because it can be blaming or shaming for some people. But to see that we do have a part as adults, we do have more agency than we realize in terms of how, in terms of the difficulties that we experience and the struggles and, relational struggles or emotional struggles that we have, and it's rather than blaming or shaming ourselves, it actually feels freeing because we start to realize that as part of agency that we have choices that we didn't realize we have, and we don't blame ourselves for not realizing it. But when the light bulb comes on, it really frees us up to see that we can do things differently, and we can be with ourselves differently and do things differently in the world than we once imagined that we could.
Well, I'm wondering if either of you would like to say just a few words about the NARM Training Institute, which you built together, and just let people know kind of what the Institute is all about. We've been referencing these classes that we teach and stuff. And yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was our vision, it got hatched between these years of Larry and I, working together and me studying under Larry, and feeling that so many people in the helping professions often feel like they're on an island by themselves. They might work in a huge hospital or a clinic or a group practice, and they often are feeling very kind of lonely with their own work. And often they're not able to speak the language that other people are speaking. They're often doing things in private because they don't want to get in trouble from, whatever is expected for them. This happens a lot for people that start to study trauma from a somatic perspective, particularly because somatic approaches are still pretty kind of fringe in a certain way, even though a lot of people have done a lot of great work on it. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a place where people could be as engaged as they want in terms of two things. One is ongoing learning and support, which is what we call consultations or supervision. And the second is ongoing opportunities for community, so that we could do both things in a place where people are appreciating and enjoying NARM and come together to learn together and grow together in both our professional and personal life. So as far as our offerings, we have 4 levels of training. The first level that Stephanie's the main teacher in is a fully online training, and it's for anyone that works with complex trauma, any helping professionals from doctors, nurses, teachers, coaches, body workers, therapists, social workers. And then level 2 and above are for mental health professionals or people that are training to be mental health professionals. And we have level 2 training, level 3 and level 4 training. You can learn more on the website. And then we offer an online program. We offer webinars. We do different kinds of events. We have an end of the year music event that we'll be doing again this year in the end of December. We have a podcast that I'm really proud of called Transforming Trauma. We have incredible people from within our NARM community, and also we bring people in. Larry's had conversations with some of the great thought leaders, Gabor Mate and Dick Schwartz and other folks. So there's just a lot of things that we're trying to be part of contributing to this trauma-informed movement. Larry, anything you wanted to add?
Well, and we also have, I think this is what you were referencing, but this, what we call an inner circle program, which is a subscription program where Brad and I do webinars every month on different topics, and we also do live demos and sometimes tape demos with debrief, and many other things as well that support learning and are sometimes also experiential, but particularly focusing on learning more about the NARM model And that's been a particularly exciting program for Brad and I. We basically do all these webinars together, and it's a fun time for the two of us to get together. We have topics that come in on our Facebook page, for example, and then we set out and we create the skeleton of the webinar, and then we present it live. Although it's available, it's available asynchronously, meaning you can get it at any time after its broadcast, but that's also been a very useful and important program for us.
Hi, Lonnie.
Stephanie, hi, how are you? Brad,
welcome
Larry,
back.
Great conversation. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we're at 7:56. We have just a couple minutes left. I want to remind folks two things. One, we're going to have after hours that's going to start at 8:05 in just a few minutes with Brad and Larry are both going to be there. Great opportunity to come join. It's a Zoom meeting, so people ask their own questions. It's very lively. How do you get to after hours? You buy a copy of the book, and the bookstall will send you a link to register. So number one. Number two is Grand Rounds is tomorrow at 12 p.m., not 7 p.m. at night, 12 p.m. Compass Health Center, our partner, is offering 1 hour CEU credit. It is free and open to the public. Anyone can come, so you don't have to be a clinician to come. That registration is open on the FAN website, so go grab that. We've been putting commercials in chat all about it. There were a couple questions submitted during the event that were a little bit more technically clinical. I'm going to pass over those just for a second because this is more for the general public tonight. So I want to make sure that we can get to some of this. But I encourage those, a handful of those clinicians who posted questions, either come to after hours or come tomorrow to the Grand Rounds if you're able. So Maureen has asked, you all have decades of experience in different models. What is the most impactful outcome or one of the most impactful you have seen or experienced with a client and or other relationships using the NARM framework? And you guys just jump in. We only have a couple minutes, so quick
It's an
answers.
interesting question. Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind as I listen to the question was I worked with this woman who had really given up completely on relationships. She thought that, and with tremendous grief about that, because she wanted to be in a relationship, but she had a number that just didn't work out for various reasons. And over a period of really, well, maybe a year and a half of work, it's like everything changed for her, and her capacity, what she came to see as part of this agency piece is that they're partly in who she was picking and partly just in her terms of her own capacities weren't developed. Her own capacity for relationship was not as developed as she thought. And as soon as that changed for her, relationships became possible and she found the love of her life. And so it was like a happy ending. And, and they're still, this couple, as far as I know, is still doing very well together. So that's one of the very touching stories that comes to my mind.
Brad, I'm going to not have you jump in. Anne-Marie, could you please post the after hours information one more time about the bookstall? There's a couple questions in Q&A. People are asking, how do they buy the book? So if you could drop that commercial in one more time in chat, I would appreciate it. Thank you. And then one last question here from Terry. And then we're in quick answers, please, or answer singular. How do we recognize and help our children with latent pandemic trauma, especially when we are still sorting it out ourselves?
Is there a quick answer?
I would say just the starting point of really being curious and reflecting both on our own experience and doing the best we can to check in with our children about that and see where they're at.
Larry, anything you want to add before we end, or Stephanie?
I was just going to say lots of listening, less with traumatized kids, with kids in general, more listening, less talking.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to go right there.
Okay.
Stephanie. So
I learned it from you, Larry.
Stephanie, thanks for your preparation and a thoughtful interview. We really do appreciate it. Larry and Brad, we're going to see you tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, for joining.